All right, let's get into the next lesson. We're going to be talking about climate and how it kind of affects ecosystems. So, climate and change in ecosystems. So, the objectives for this one are going to be to identify the various effects of climate change on an ecosystem or ecosystems, describe environmental factors that can cause changes in ecosystems, and compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages of natural change to ecosystems and unnatural change. All right, so change in ecosystems. So, some things that happen with changes in ecosystems with climate warming trends. This is what we're going to talk about because that's the trend that we're on. Scientifically and historically, for the past 100 or so years, we've been on a climate warming trend. The past 10 years have been the highest in recorded observable history. So we are getting a higher temperature on Earth. That cannot be debated. Okay, so things that happen with climate warming trends are we get this early onset of spring events. So examples of that are going to be flowering, fruit ripening, unfolding of leaves, and hatching of eggs. So with a warmer climate, you're going to have these early onset of spring events. It's going to shorten the winter season, elongate the spring season. So the animals are going to have to try and scramble to kind of adapt to that environment. So you're going to get birds laying their eggs sooner, birds hatching sooner. And normally this is an okay thing because especially with fruits ripening earlier, you get these ecosystems opening up in new times. It kind of allows for this succession period to start. But really why it's a bad thing is because of the rate. So the rate at which the seasons are shortening and elongating, the rate at which the spring events are becoming earlier and earlier is frightening because these organisms need a lot of time to be able to adapt to these types of things. So we're talking like multiple generations. That's what we talked about with evolution. So with earlier onset of spring events, more of these organisms are not going to be able to adapt quick enough. So we're going to get a lot more death, more mortality. So we may get these birds that come up, they change their migration process, they come up sooner, they lay their eggs, and then, it seems like it's going to be warmer because we have an earlier spring onset. But with these extreme changes in temperatures, we could have a day in the spring that they think is spring that is 60 degrees, and then the next day we have a frost, which is going to kill the babies. It's going to kill the babies, it's going to kill the fruit, it's going to kill the flowers. So that's generally not such a great thing when we experience this larger rate of change. So more warming trends and change. So with more warmth, we're going to get a rising level of CO2. That's just a pretty natural thing. We also are exponentially increasing the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere. That's a human effect. But naturally, with a warmer climate, you're going to get more CO2 in the system as well. So a good thing about that is you're going to get an increase in photosynthesis, which is how plants grow. So they're going to use that carbon to grow, and that's going to increase crop productivity. So, there's a lot of factors with that one, but that's just kind of like a on the surface good thing with a rise in CO2. Generally, there's a lot of other factors that come into play there that make it not such a good thing, but we're going to try and weigh the bads with the goods, sort of. The effect on marine ecosystems, however, with warming trends and that rise in CO2, is that we're going to get this acidic ocean. So if you've heard about ocean acidification, it's a real thing. It's happening. What's happening is it's a very, very simple chemistry equation. Carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. It bonds with water in the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide bonded with water creates an acidic solution. So that acidic solution is going to be a precipitate. It's going to fall into the ocean. More CO2 is going to go into the ocean as well and bond with that water. We're going to get this acidification process happening. It's going to negatively affect most marine life, but the ones that are affected the greatest are corals, mollusks, most echinoderms. That's because they use carbonate to grow. And the thing about carbonate is when you get an acidic solution and you mix it with carbonate, it breaks the carbonate down. So not only is there going to be less carbonate in the system, but that acid is going to be breaking down the outer layers of echinoderms and mollusks. And then coral is going to have this bleaching process happen, which essentially, I'll show you right here. You can look at this with greater detail if you'd like. Essentially what happens is coral has all of these algae around it, and those algae are basically what feed the corals. So what happens with that acidification is that the algae gets stressed, they leave the coral, or they die. The coral is left with no algae, just hard parts. It dies, this is bleached, so all of the color is gone. All it's got left is this carbonate, and then it's left vulnerable to other algae, and so then it gets covered in this other algae that is not mutually beneficial, so it's dying. And then here is just 1 year of change with the coral. So here's a healthy coral system in 2014. In 2015, it has been bleached, all the algae is gone, and that's February. Then August 2015, that whole segment of coral is dead. So that's really important because coral is a really good ecosystem for many different, a great range of species. So that increases biodiversity. So what also happens with an increase in temperature is animal migration changes and you get increased ranges for other species. So with warming, animals are going to migrate north earlier and more often to occupy previously uninhabitable ecosystems. So they're going to also migrate to higher elevations. As those elevations get warmer, it's going to be easier for them to occupy that space. So another thing that happens is the lengthening of the growing season and an earlier start to spring growth. So that's going to increase the range of plant and animal species and insect species as well. So a bad thing about that, this is just a real quick glance at a bad thing of it, is invasive species. So you're going to get a lot of weeds coming into an area where they previously were not. They're going to take over that area, destroy, they're basically going to outcompete all of the original plants there. And then mosquitoes as well. So you're going to get more mosquitoes with more warmth. And then that's just going to increase disease, more death, all sorts of things like that. So that's just real quick. And then good-ish is there's going to be more potential for food crops and pollination with that lengthening of the growing season and an increased range in plant and insect species. The bad thing about that is we're going to have more fertilizer and more pesticides. And pesticides are known to kind of start this extinction process for insect species because they break down their outer skeleton. So it's good-ish. It's not really all that great to have an increased range and more temperature. So you get an increased risk of extinction with niche species with that warming. So niche species are species that need a specific set of environmental circumstances to habitate that area. So they have a really small range tolerance. And the range is just an area where a specific species can be found during its lifetime. So that's a hypothetical thing, but it's also quantified and observable. We know where animals are going to go and where they're able to go. So with those niche species and an increase in warmth and an increase in available habitat for other species, you're going to get a decrease in population, you're going to get changes in migratory patterns, and a risk for extinction for those niche species. So that's going to be a quiz question. The increased risk of extinction for these niche species is right there. Those are the three factors there that happen with an increase in temperature. So environmental factors causing change. Human activity, that's probably number one. What we do, we change the habitat, we make habitat different, we destroy habitat, we fragment it, which is like one of the worst things for biodiversity, and biodiversity is one of the best things for creating a healthy ecosystem and biosphere, so the whole planet. With more species, we get a lot more diversity, we get more benefits from those species. They maintain homeostasis in a certain ecosystem, which means they kind of keep it stable. So global warming, there's a very, very high correlation between human activity and global warming. So what's going to happen is we're going to get increased extreme weather events because we know that heat is energy and more heat in the system. It's going to create more energy for the system, so we're going to get crazier hurricanes, crazier tornadoes, all sorts of that stuff. We learned about that in the weather lesson, so you can put those two together. With global warming, you're going to get range change. We just talked about why that's bad, and ocean acidification, and we just talked about why that's bad. So more human activity causing environmental change is going to be disease events. So when we put livestock in enclosed quarters, we increase the chances of a disease event happening, and then the chances of that disease event escaping into the natural realm is increased like tenfold. So that's also kind of a bad thing that we do. And then we increase invasive species just through global warming and through, sometimes we just inadvertently bring invasive species into certain areas, or we do it on purpose. Usually invasive species are not great for ecosystems. So we also pollute the areas. So we use fertilizers for all of our crops. And so fertilizers, basically, they're going to be nitrogen and phosphorus that kind of helps with plant growth. So those are nutrients. What we're doing is, since they're soluble in water, which means when water hits those nutrients, they connect with that water and then they move with it. So what's happening is those nutrients are going to increase in the soil and the water in that area, and then they're going to follow whatever water patterns they are. They're also going to stay in the rocks. There's a high percentage of nutrients in the rocks. They call them a nutrient time bomb right now. So that's a thing that we need to start looking at, because what happens is farmers continuously pump this fertilizer onto these plants, and they don't really worry about where it's going. They just worry about their plant growth. So an example of a bad part of it is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So the dead zone, essentially, we had an increase in nutrients into the system, which is the Mississippi River. It went down into the Gulf of Mexico. It increased in algal bloom because there was more nitrogen and phosphorus for that algae to use. So there's a lot more algae. There were a lot more algae blooms. And when that happens, there is a decrease of oxygen in the system. So that algae is kind of using the oxygen up in that system. So there's no more oxygen for any other organism to use in that certain water system. So you're going to get fish dying, and it's a dead zone is what we call it. So here's an example of habitat fragmentation. So right here, this all used to be forest. So, you know, we had all these bears living here in this forest, and then we decided to build upon it. So we fragmented this whole area up. Now, while they still have, you know, maybe 5 square miles of area to move about, this is the only area that certain population will be using, most likely. So it's really not 5 areas, it's about a half of a mile. And then you get increased chances of wildlife meeting with humans and you know, all sorts of things like that. It's generally a very bad thing. So here is a good little graphic. We've got these bears, they're all happy. There's a lot of genetic diversity going on because this bear can reproduce with this one can go with this one. Then we get a road, and that separates both of them. So this is going to have a lot less genetic diversity, which eventually will cause that system to crash. And then it's only got one bear, so he doesn't know what to do. He's going to try and cross the road. He's going to get hit by a car and die. And then this whole area is not used by this bear anymore. And then these are going to crash. So what we do is we do like little natural formations, like bridge crossings over the freeway, so that the animals are able to make it into separate habitats. America doesn't do this very often, this whole thing. So what we do is we just say, okay, screw the animals. We're going to build all around here. We're going to have enough space, technically, as a loophole, so that they have enough, there's enough of a habitat for them to live, but really there isn't. They have this habitat, they have a little bit right here. They don't connect. So that's a really, really bad thing for biodiversity. And so before we get into the natural changes, I'm going to just stop this video because I only have 15 minutes, and we'll have another video finishing this whole PowerPoint.